Quote, "The madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God'?" As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. "Has he got lost?" asked one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" asked another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated?" Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all, that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods, simply to appear worthy of it? There has never yet been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. "I have come too early," he said then. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." It has been related further that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, "What after all are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" End quote. God is dead, and we have killed him. Probably the most quoted line from Nietzsche, or at least it's in the top three, along with "live dangerously" and "what doesn't kill me makes me stronger." This passage, the madman passage, where the "God is dead" saying appears, is one of the most famous passages in all of Nietzsche's work, and for good reason. It's very dense, it's rich in philosophical insight, it's rich in lyrical imagery, and it's a striking and memorable scene that Nietzsche creates here. It leaves a lasting impact on most of us who read it. But it might not be immediately obvious to you what it means, especially in light of the fact that so many interpreters have commented on this passage. So much has been said about it that the text almost disappears beneath the weight of all these later interpretations. So what we'll do is consider this passage not only in terms of my own interpretation of it, but we'll also consider where other readers have had something insightful to say about it. And so this is going to be a relatively long exegesis, considering, relative to the other passages we've talked about in the gay science, but I want to go through and break down a lot of the philosophical points being made in this passage, what the broader context of where this passage appears in the gay science tells us about what Nietzsche's doing here, and then some of the things that have been said in interpretation, and hopefully you'll come away with a more complete reading than is usually presented when people talk about this passage. So the madman lights a lantern, even though it is the bright morning hours. And he goes into town saying, "I seek God, I seek God." There's almost certainly a reference here to Diogenes of Sinope. That's the philosopher that Plato called a Socrates gone mad. So Diogenes is a philosophical madman, you might say. He also walked into town with a lantern lit in daylight, only he was recorded as saying, "I seek a man," or sometimes, "I seek a true man," or an honest man. So we might say Diogenes goes looking for a real human being, and he's accounted mad. The average people scoff at this, right? In the same way that the atheists in Nietzsche's passage also scoff, because obviously there are lots of human beings standing around you right at this moment, Diogenes, right? And yet that obviously isn't the point of his stunt, we might say. So we should consider the parallel with what Nietzsche is doing in critiquing our soon-to-be post-Christian society, we might say. We could consider the parallel with Diogenes critiquing Greek pagan society. According to the values of the Greeks, which Nietzsche interprets as human-centric, insofar as their worldly values, values that concern themselves with the lives of human beings, the realities of the human condition, the reality of man as a political animal and as a part of nature, within that Greek value system, the highest thing to pursue is virtue, being a good person. Not good in the Christian sense of the word necessarily. A virtuous man is a good man because he is, among other things, truthful. And truthful means honest, yes. It also means that your words match your deeds, that your claims are made true by your actions, we might say, that your promises are actually fulfilled. Nietzsche discusses this in the Genealogy. It's a foregone conclusion among the Greek nobles that the ignoble people lie. The Greek nobility refer to themselves as "we truthful ones." And so Diogenes' critique is apropos to that kind of society, that the society that he's in. He's saying, show me a real man, a true man. Where is he? If the Greek value set is supposed to be closer to nature, Diogenes would say, no, it isn't. You live unnaturally. You impose these rules that attempt to tame the human animal. You ornament yourselves with these fancy words and ideas. And after all of this, where is this perfected human being that your morality claims to aim at? And so Nietzsche's madman is addressing a different age. Yes, it's a Christian age, but I'm using the term post-Christian in a technical sense here, insofar as Nietzsche believes that even among those who no longer believe in the myths and superstitions of Christianity, they still hold Christian values. And more than that, Christianity even creeps into our metaphysics, into their construction of the world, the way they think about reality as such. And that's why it's very important, as I said before, to contextualize this passage, because at the beginning of Book 3 of The Gay Science, several sections before this, Nietzsche says that God is dead. He makes the claim before this passage. But in that passage, he says we have yet to vanquish his shadow. And in the following section, after that one, he says that conceiving of the world as though it has some sort of overarching order or purpose, or conceiving of the world as being, even objectively speaking, a material world, or even to conceive of natural laws. All of this is still a deification of nature, as he calls it. And he asks in that passage, quote, when will these shadows of God cease to darken our minds, end quote. We've discussed this quite a bit in the previous episodes on The Gay Science, but to sum it up briefly, Nietzsche's concern with throughout this first part of the book is the way in which our metaphysical suppositions about reality might be absolutely necessary for us in order to reason about reality at all, but they may still be errors. And this will make more sense, I think, if you consider Kant's rebuttal to Hume, that we must be able to make these transcendental judgments, what Kant calls synthetic judgments a priori, which are statements, what Kant would include under that category would be things, judgments such as every event has a cause. You have to presuppose that in order to reason at all. In other words, Hume questioned whether we can actually know that the future will be like the past, and then Kant comes in to reply, we don't know that empirically, we can't prove it logically, but we know it transcendentally, which is to say, it's knowledge that is not simply contained in the internal logic of the statement, and it is knowledge that we have prior to experience. So Kant tries to salvage things like induction or causality by claiming that these propositions are necessary. Nietzsche's counter to this in the preceding sections of The Gay Science would be that even if they are necessary, that doesn't prove anything. Nietzsche writes, quote, We have arranged for ourselves a world in which we can live by positing bodies, lines, planes, causes and effects, motion and rest, form and content. Without these articles of faith, nobody could now endure life, but that does not prove them. Life is no argument. The conditions of life might include error." End quote. Now, as for what Nietzsche thinks reality really is, he puts forward the interpretation that it is a chaos, a Heraclitean flux, a becoming in which no one phenomenon has an independent existence from any other. And furthermore, we only know this flux, we only know this chaos through sense impressions, which never permit us to posit anything about the underlying substance or essence of the so-called objects that make those impressions. Far from Nietzsche concluding that this means the world is an illusion, which might be the conclusion that somebody like Schopenhauer would come to, Nietzsche concludes that the senses should be our new anchor, our new center. We should let go of these claims about reality independent of the human mind and accept that we live in a reality that's in fact dependent on the mind. The senses don't hide a true world. As Nietzsche says in Twilight of Idols, in fact, the senses don't lie at all. The problem with this, for many people, is that it flies in the face of that Platonic world of ideas that they've implicitly accepted, and so this is, to bring it back, that's part and parcel of the shadow cast by monotheism on our thought. The intelligible world of ideas seems to anchor us in this flux by creating the concept, a stable unitary thing which endures independently of all the changes and all the transformations that are constantly occurring. So those conceptions that Nietzsche mentions, line, form, bodies, causality, and so on, that all might be absolutely necessary to the mind, but it doesn't make them eternal facts. It only means just what it means, that they are necessary concepts for us. The reason why this is all a hangover from monotheism is because Nietzsche sees God as the direct descendant of Plato's form of the good, the eternal, enduring unity of God. It's held up and counterposed against the changeable, impermanent world. The Christian, in other words, believes in being. He believes, as Descartes does, that the senses are real, not because he trusts his senses. Descartes doubts the senses, but because he trusts God. He trusts that God wouldn't create an illusory world. The Christian believes he has a soul, that his self is one thing, that he is an enduring reality. He too is part of being, not just another, provisionally designated object in this changeable flux of becoming that boggles the mind and ultimately indicates a reality which is beyond comprehension, which can't be encapsulated by logic in the final analysis. And most importantly, the post-Christians, the atheists in the marketplace, they believe all of this too. They also declare the objective reality of the physical world. Not because they believe in an unmediated world of sensation like Nietzsche does, but because, like Kant, they would say we have to believe in matter and causality and substance and so on. To abandon those things is to threaten the possibility, it's to threaten the possibility that reason can't encompass the world, right? It takes away your ability to say that your mind can, perfectly or almost perfectly model existence. If all of the conceptual frameworks you use for modeling it are errors, albeit necessary or useful ones, you're left with the position that we have no truth, at least truth in that Platonic sense. And so, a lot is said about what Nietzsche thinks the artifacts of Christian belief are in our society. And often people frame this in terms of morals, which is certainly true. The values system that many atheists promote is also a reflection of Christian morality, charity, pity, selflessness, and so on. But the metaphysics, I think, is really important here, because many atheists would deny that they're carrying on in the tradition of Christian metaphysics, but Nietzsche would say the through line through all of this is that Platonic intelligible world. And so we might compare Nietzsche to Kierkegaard in this passage. Kierkegaard famously said that Christianity has long been in need of a man who, in fear and trembling before God, forbid men from reading from the Bible. Kierkegaard also wrote, "It's necessary to oppose Christianity. It's necessary to be a missionary within Christendom." In other words, Kierkegaard walked among Christians and he preached at Christians while holding that they weren't really Christian, that they hadn't really confronted the deep struggle at the heart of the faith, that being a true Christian is perhaps the hardest thing in the world. It requires a continuous daily wrestling with one's faith. It's not about rote memorization. It's not about following certain rules. It's not about uttering catechisms. It's not about any of those things. It's about becoming the knight of faith, really, which is, Kierkegaard says, is infinitely above him. The people who approximate it are like Abraham, these heroes of the Bible. So likewise, Nietzsche's Madman doesn't preach to Christians to tell them that God is dead. He preaches, and he doesn't preach to Greeks as Diogenes does. He preaches to modern atheists, those who don't believe in God, and they ridicule the madman. They ask, "Oh, you see God? Well, where is he gone?" Right? So Kierkegaard is a Christian attacking Christianity because they haven't really understood the deep struggle demanded of them, the challenge demanded of them, if they wish to take up that name, Christian. Nietzsche is an atheist attacking atheists because they also haven't understood the real challenge demanded of them by denying God, that it means they also have to throw off the shadow of God and confront the infinite. In the preceding passage to this one, the one immediately before it, he says that where we have proceeded based on the philosophical insights up to this point in the book, he compares it to a voyage on the open sea, having left behind the land, burned all bridges behind us, and he says now there's no land to return to. All we can do is confront the infinite, the chaos, the Heraclitean becoming, the flux of existence in all its awe and its awesomeness and its terror, right? And so perhaps we could say, confront it with an appropriate amount of fear and trembling, right? As Kierkegaard would have put it with his famous turn of phrase. Now, this is not, as some have suggested, a call to return to Christianity. I wouldn't even say that it's not really a warning of what happens when we abandon it, in the sense of, turn back now, something like that. I think it's very clear from the surrounding context, and also the aphorism that appears later in Book 5, what our cheerfulness signifies, that that's not Nietzsche's aim. The way I would put it is that courage is only necessary if there is fear to overcome. And what Nietzsche wants from us is a courageous response to the situation. The problem is you will never be able to actually confront that task, that challenge, that greatest task set before mankind, if you do think it's a trivial matter. Oh, we just cast off some superstitions. Just the same way that the Christians, the ordinary common sense Christians in name only that Kierkegaard questioned, would have, thumbed their nose that there was some deep struggle every single day with your faith that you had to do to call yourself a Christian. So Nietzsche is drawing attention to the atheists who think the absence of God is a trivial matter, and he's pointing out to them just how much courage will be required in light of their great task, which they have not comprehended. It's not a call to go back, though, and I think that's very clear from the context, and we'll get into that as we go on. But let's look at some of the elements of the passage here. So when the madman asks, what were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Where are we moving? This is the unchaining of reality from the doctrine of being. The doctrine of being, which it goes all the way back to the Eleatics, Parmenides and Zeno. And then through them, it comes to us through Plato and Aristotle, and then through Christianity. But there's another aspect of this, which is not just metaphysical, but also moral. Is there any way up or down? Where are we moving? Away from all suns? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? So there was something about Christianity that was orienting for mankind. It allowed us to get our footing, so to speak. Not just for metaphysical orientation, the doctrine of being, but also it provided a rank ordering of values. It told us what was up and what was down, what was highest and what was lowest in human life. And so Christianity elevates the priestly ideal, the ascetic ideal, which Nietzsche opposes and he criticizes, but nevertheless, this provided an ethos. It provided a rank ordering. And so the ascetic life is the highest way of life, and we might say like a life of sin and debauchery is the lowest, but that gives us something stable, a guiding star, something to look up to, something to avoid. It gave us what Nietzsche would later call the one thing that's needful, a yes or no, a straight line, a goal. It gave us a horizon, a future. And Nietzsche clarifies in one of his notes when he discusses the things that Christianity provided for mankind. This is in Will to Power, note number 4, where he says that, quote, the advantages of the Christian moral hypothesis, end quote, are that 1, it granted man, quote, absolute value. 2, it made evil appear, quote, full of meaning. 3, posited that man had knowledge of values. 4, quote, prevented man from despising himself as man, from taking sides against life, end quote. The interesting aspect of this is that Nietzsche condemns Christianity as a form of nihilism, as hostile to life. It makes its value system ultimately aimed at the otherworldly, which is to say what happens to the soul after death, and therefore it detaches itself from life, from the physical existence. Nevertheless, from this note in Will to Power, we can gather that it's not a strictly negative development. It reminds me of the way Nietzsche talks about Socrates and the Socratic revolution in values. This is in Birth of Tragedy. Socrates created this theoretical approach to life, which Nietzsche thinks was ultimately the decline of Hellenic society, and yet he also says without Socrates, they may not have survived at all. So you may have to adopt a values set, a table of values, which is less than ideal, might be sick in many ways, but you might have to adopt that in order to keep you alive. And so here in Will to Power, he makes it clear that even though Christianity is at bottom nihilistic, it was also an antidote against, quote, practical and theoretical nihilism, end quote. Another way of talking about this is in terms Nietzsche will use in his next book, Zarathustra, when he describes the overman as the meaning of the earth. The overman is the new value that Nietzsche is trying to set up. So the overman is the aim for which we will sacrifice, for which we will be willing to suffer, and even to go under, to perish in pursuit of the great and impossible, as he says. The reason why the overman idea has to be able to provide those things is precisely because that is what Christianity provided. A reason for being, a meaning for suffering, a real value, a real purpose for human life. So again, the critique of the marketplace atheists is that they don't see how the death of God, the decline of the Christian belief, the fact that it has become, as Nietzsche will later say, unworthy of belief, has untethered us in this way. That was a metaphysical anchor. It was a moral guidepost. And the depth of the challenge facing us, as those who have killed God, is the challenge to replace all that. And that's why we must become gods ourselves in order to become worthy of the deed, which requires us as humans to legislate new tables of values. That's all the more difficult to imagine because that's precisely the thing that Christianity has taught us is beyond our power. That mankind on its own is we're sinful, we're wretched, we require the tutelage, the instruction, the grace of a higher power. Christianity denies that its values came from a worldly origin. Christians would say that believing Christians would say that their value system is actually otherworldly. And that all, man-made values are just, they're hubristic. They lead to our downfall. It's worshiping Mammon instead of God, however they would put it. And so that's why it's so important that the madman declares they have done it themselves. So as we see in Nietzsche's work, once again in the genealogy on the ascetic ideal, the values of Christianity are created as an act of mankind. These ascetic values, these Christian values, this whole worldview, however much it's been pushed into the realm of the divine, was also a human creation from Nietzsche's perspective. All of these past lawgivers, including Jesus and Paul, were human beings. And the revaluation of the value of Christianity, creation of new values that overcome the Christian, will also have to be an act of mankind. It was when we were so totally within that otherworldly value system, though, that it almost became impossible to imagine that values could come from mankind. Another thing that's worth considering, again, context. 3 sections before this, the passage when Nietzsche says, it's the moral skepticism of Christianity, that's what killed the religion. So it's an explanation of how this happened, how we killed God. And to put it simply, Christianity was inherently skeptical of the possibility of human virtue. Remember, again, the pagan ideal against which Christianity was a reaction. That ideal held that virtue is attainable. The Christians say no, the best you can do is repent. The best you can do is acknowledge how unvirtuous you really are. Guilt, the bad conscience, that's one of the central religious feelings or states of mind in Christianity. And that feeling leads you to inquire into your own behavior, be critical of your own behavior, and it undermines and leads you to disbelieve any pretense of virtue, to investigate our own motives, our own intentions, always on the lookout for sin or pride or evil, always keenly aware of those human, all too human faults within ourselves, right? So what does Nietzsche say about this? Well, he says it developed this talent for moral skepticism, and as it became developed, that became second nature for us. And then we applied that moral skepticism to Christianity itself. We applied that same moral skepticism not just to those states of the soul that the religion taught us to be critical of, but to those states of the soul that the religion exalted and held to the highest. As Nietzsche says, we allowed the worm of critique to dig in there too, and inquire critically into sin, repentance, and grace, and so on. Now, we can cross-reference this with something in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra meets the ugliest man, who's identified as God's killer. This is what that character says, quote, "But he had to die. He saw with eyes that saw everything. He saw man's depths and ultimate grounds, all his concealed disgrace and ugliness. His pity knew no shame. He crawled into my dirtiest nooks. The God who saw everything, even man. This God had to die. Man cannot bear it, that such a witness should live," end quote. So what the ugliest man says is really just like an allegorical rephrasing of the account that Nietzsche gives of the moral skepticism of Christianity turned against the religion. So Christianity, it has the Christian value system that we adopt. We're led to internalize this self-critical, self-conscious attitude towards ourselves, to crawl into our depths, into our concealed disgrace and ugliness, into our dirtiest nooks. That's the motivation for this fictitious character who kills God, because of the very fact that Christianity calls us to witness, to be truthful about ourselves and our own immorality, and it posits the existence of that eternal and all-knowing witness. Christianity is consequently, quote-unquote, killed as a result of this same thing. It is killed by perhaps the ugliest aspect of ourselves, by the most vicious, base, and ignoble aspects. And why would that be? Well, perhaps because those are the traits that Christianity nurtured. In Nietzsche's interpretation, anyway, Christianity makes us more vicious, base, and ignoble. The very acquisition of self-consciousness and the imputation of guilt to ourselves is a loss of what is noble. Because to Nietzsche's mind, the original noble valuations of life, the valuations made by those Greek pagans, were defined by a kind of self-forgetting, a kind of almost childlike innocence. Compared to the Christians, the Greeks are like children. The ugliest man, on the other hand, is somebody who's been stained with the cynicism and recriminations of adulthood, right? He's gone through the entire cycle, the entire 2 millennia of Christianity, and that's what awaits at the end of that process. Now, I said we would consider some other interpretations of the passage. Let's consider some of the lines. The Madman says, quote, What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? End quote. It's very interesting to read René Girard's comment on this. Girard was a critic of Nietzsche. He was a Christian, and he believed that Christianity represented a repudiation of the pagan rituals of collective murder, and that those rituals of scapegoating and murder are what characterize the entire pagan world. And he points to a number of examples of this. I mean, I just mentioned the scapegoating ritual of the Hebrews. There's also the Greek ritual slaughter of animals so that the flesh could be offered to the gods. But Girard says that the further you go back in history, the more likely that these rituals didn't sacrifice animals, but actually human beings. And that, in fact, many of these myths and stories, so for example, Nietzsche's favorite Greek god Dionysus is a great example because he's ripped asunder by the Titans, and this event is dramatized in the Greek tragedies. There are all these stories in which some crisis or social disorder erupts into the community, and the community finds cohesion again by collectively committing violence against a victim. And in fact, the victim is innocent. It's almost a requirement that the victim be innocent, right? If the scapegoat weren't clean, how could you fill, if he weren't empty of sins, how could you fill it with the community's sins? You could look at it like that. But, being pagans and without much of a self-consciousness of guilt, the ancient societies were naive in their acts of violence, frankly. They persecuted a helpless individual. But through this coming together as a community in the act of committing communal violence, the community is able to cohere together once again. And that, again, all ancient societies, all pre-Christian societies, in Girard's view, end up having recourse to this pattern of pagan collective violence. This is what Girard says about the Madman passage in Nietzsche. Quote, "The references to the blood and to the knife and to the wiping of the blood forcefully take us back to the first announcement of the madman. God did not die a natural death, he was collectively killed. And the crime is so great that new festivals of atonement, new sacred games will have to be invented. New rituals will undoubtedly appear. The consequences of God's murder are religious, therefore, purely religious. The very deed that seems to put an end to the religious process is really the origin of that process, the sum total of it, really the religious process par excellence. These new festivals and sacred games will certainly reenact the collective murder of God. They will be sacrificial rites. The death of God is also his birth. If God is always the product of his own collective murder, does not this text really say that the death of the gods is their life, and that the life of the gods is their death? What kind of eternal return of religion is this? Can Nietzsche himself account for all this?" End quote. So Girard brings a focus to his interpretation of the passage to the fact that God didn't simply drop dead. He was murdered. That is the language that is used, and he sees a parallel to the pagan rituals of collective murder here, insofar as the pagans would commemorate these acts of collective violence with just such rituals of atonement and sacred games, that they became the origin of these sacrificial rites, or of the Dionysia, these ritual portrayals of the act. What he means when he says the death of God is also his birth is that some have even theorized that the people who would come to be worshipped as gods had to die or had to be killed before they could be deified. That many of these stories of gods and demigods were actually based on human beings. But even in the stories we have, even if we leave that to one side, even within the mythology, there are just so many tales of this theme of the death and resurrection of the gods, often after they're torn asunder or unjustly killed. Another interpreter of the death of God passage that Girard actually cites in the essay, that I think we have to bring up in light of this, is Sigmund Freud. He wrote about this in Totem and Taboo, that a collective murder of some real human being, some real man, was the origin of all, quote, festivals of purification and atonement, all sacred games, end quote, which is the exact language that Nietzsche uses. Now, specifically what Freud theorized in Totem and Taboo was that the many myths of the overthrow of an original tyrannical father king, right, we might think of Zeus overthrowing Kronos. There are stories like this all over the ancient canons of myth. That these are, in some way, allegories or dramatizations of a prehistoric struggle that must have occurred probably even before the dawn of civilization. Freud's reasoning is something like this. Originally, you probably had one strong male who dominated each kin group, perhaps in the way a dominant chimp or even a dominant male lion behaves. And that what must have happened, in order for society to even become possible, society in any sense we would understand it today, what must have happened is for multiple of the lesser males to band together and collectively murder this father king. And it's likely that many of these murderers would actually be this figure's actual sons. But they would have to do this because a lone tyrannical male dominating the harem prevents any other males from reproducing. And so Freud imagines, to oversimplify things greatly, a bunch of the sons of tyrannical alpha males banded together, murdered him, and founded society. In other words, they set down rules so that no one of them would ever become that lone tyrannical alpha male ever again. And therefore, over time, they would have developed rather complex feelings about this event as it stretched into their generational memory. They would come to regard the king who died as a god whose death provided the very foundations of society. Perhaps out of their guilt for having killed their father, or perhaps out of gratitude, they would atone and purify themselves, on the anniversary of the date when it happened or whatever. They would celebrate with sacred games, and over time, the historical and very human origin of this deity would be forgotten. Freud connects that myth to the Oedipus complex, and he thinks that's why the Oedipus complex is so innately a part of the human psyche, because the birth of civilization, and therefore the whole birth of the regime of morality, and thus the superego that regulates the psyche and is responsible for so many pathologies and problems, this all emerges at the point of murdering one's own father and divvying up his wives. So, in any case, there's a very real possibility that Freud is inspired in Totem and Taboo by this Madman passage, as Girard draws that connection there. But, let's lay the Oedipus complex and all of that. Let's take that and set it to one side, though it's certainly very interesting. Girard quotes from it because he thinks Freud was onto something, at least insofar as the stories about the deaths of gods or the deaths of great kings are evidence of this long pattern of pagan ritual murder that goes back millennia and indeed before that into prehistory. And it's also worth noting that Girard's contention is that the murder of Jesus was just such a collective pagan murder. The difference with the Jesus story is that the example of Jesus confronts us with the absolute innocence of the victim, because this time you killed God made man, right? And therefore imputes guilt onto all parties involved, and indeed onto everyone who participates in society, because society is driven by, it's renewed by the cohesion that's produced by these collective murders. And that the pattern of God dying in order to be deified happens perhaps most strongly with Christ. Like, he's martyred and therefore he becomes a god, but he doesn't become some regional god or the head of some cult. He becomes this universal deity, and like a monotheistic deity. And to some extent, Girard's interpretation is that we can see the intuition in Nietzsche of the fact that this is not the end of religion. It's actually the birth of a new religion, which I think Nietzsche would actually agree with. Girard, of course, his main problem is that he contests that Christianity is truly dead, and he would contend that many of these elements that he's drawing out of Nietzsche's thought actually can't be accounted for, that they're things, again, in Nietzsche's intuition that are not accounted for in his philosophy. As for my rebuttal to that, or my response and interpretation, it would simply be, I think Nietzsche is actually well aware that he is trying to create a kind of new religious sentiment. And indeed, we see in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that he's writing a new holy book. He's trying to found a new religion. He's trying to speak in the language of allegory and myth and poetry. So, and trying to, he's not philosophizing with the aim of getting at the objective truth of things. He's not a philosopher in that vein who's committed to that. He turns his attention to value And he's also very aware, as he's talked about, of all of these legislators, lawgivers, whatever you want to call them, Plato, Jesus, Muhammad, Gautama Buddha, all of whom had to commit a holy lie in order to, they had to do what was immoral in order to make man moral. In other words, to improve or elevate mankind. So that there's always a Platonic, magnificent myth at the beginning of a new revaluation of values. Which in Plato's Republic is explicitly religious. He basically says we should raise the children with these new myths. Independent of whether they're true or not, they will have value. They will positively change the way that the children of our Republic look at and view the world and act within it. And so I think that is what Nietzsche's trying to do with Zarathustra. And I think Nietzsche might deny that the Christian God being dead is the beginning of the Christian God's life, at least not in the way that Girard is talking about it. Because you could say the literal death of Jesus that creates the Christian God, that was the event. That was the God dying so that he could live. Nietzsche's Madman saying God is dead is really pointing to not any physical event, but something that's gone on in all of our minds of the devaluation of the metaphysical and moral worldview that religion that endured for 2 millennia has given us. And this dovetails into the interpretation of another Christian writer that we have to discuss here, Carl Jung, who said in his lectures on Zarathustra that Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead is a parallel to the ancient story that Pan is dead. As that story goes, a sailor came into port, I believe in Ostia in the 2nd century AD. He asked to speak to the Roman emperor, and he told the Roman emperor that he and his crew overheard the chanting of cultists on an island and that they declared the great god Pan is dead. Pan is not Dionysus precisely, but we might say he's Dionysus adjacent. He's a nature god. He's a rustic god, god of wild places. He appears as a satyr. And he came to be called in the Roman period the god of the all, the god of all nature. If the pagan religion was a more natural one, then perhaps Pan was sort of the highest apotheosis of that idea. And then this synchronous event happens right around when Christianity is beginning to spread. These cultists of Pan cry out in lamentation that their god is dead. And this is Jung, quote, "About the 2nd century AD, rumor spread that Pan the Greatest was dead. Christianity had prevailed against him, the last conception of a nature god created by antiquity. And when the god is dead, it means the end of an epoch," end quote. Now, I think that's much more commensurate with Nietzsche's own position than Girard's interpretation. Jung would say that the divine is doing something more like changing masks, changing personas, being embodied or manifest in a different kind of image. Girard, he's pointing to Nietzsche using the language of God being dead, God being murdered, and pointing out that's how the gods live again. But Nietzsche, I think, would look at the Christian God being dead as more like the great god Pan being declared dead, not at the beginning of Pan's ascendance, but at the end. At the time when you can see the next thing, Christianity, which has been festering in Rome for the Roman Empire for 2 centuries and is about to explode over the next 2 centuries. Perhaps they were able to see that coming, or perhaps that's just a rumor, a fable, or something like that. Now, where Jung would differ from Nietzsche, and it's where he gets a bit psychoanalytical with Nietzsche. It's in his assertion that Nietzsche's character Zarathustra is an archetype within Nietzsche's psyche that has become inflated. That Nietzsche has created this figure Zarathustra who resembles the wise king or the wise old man archetype, and he's taken over Nietzsche's psyche, which is very unhealthy for one. Really the archetypes are not actually your personality. They come from the collective unconscious, so they're parts of the collective human psyche. So when an archetype begins to take over your personality in a way, it's sort of like overwhelms and destroys your personality. But that's who Jung alleges that's what happens to Nietzsche, is that the figure of the wise old man inflates, takes over Nietzsche's psyche to preach the word that God is dead. Quote, Zarathustra is convinced there is no God outside of him. God is dead, end quote. And furthermore, because Zarathustra was the first, in Nietzsche's interpretation, to establish this dichotomy between good and evil, Zarathustra is the one to repudiate that dichotomy. Jung writes, quote, the same spirit that taught mankind the difference between good and evil is now informing us of the fact that there is no difference, and that God is dead, end quote. Now, again, for Jung, he considers these philosophical positions of Nietzsche to be kind of pathologies because, again, gods have died in the past, but the divine always returns. And Jung, again, conceives of it as a changing of masks of the divine rather than the divine truly dying. God can't be contained within a symbol. Whenever we begin to attach ourselves too fondly to a symbol, or we become too rigid in our thought according to the dogmas and doctrines that are demanded by that particular image of God, the divine, almost as like a compensation or compensatory action, evacuates from the symbol. It escapes the symbol and moves to something else. And it is, in fact, a sort of like, it's like a higher religious insight to realize that there's no God in a symbol. There's no God outside of yourself. And furthermore, even the blurring of the distinction between good and evil, the rejection of this simple dichotomy altogether. That's an almost universal insight shared by the mystical traditions, the higher levels of religious understanding. We can find this the world over, from Meister Eckhart to Lao Tzu to Nagarjuna. So Jung's interpretation would be, in so many words, Nietzsche went mad from obsessing over these insights into the chaotic flux of reality, which are actually many of the same insights that religious people make. He declared the death of God because he found no God outside of himself without recognizing that God is always reborn and that the divine is inside. And he saw beyond good and evil but failed to see how this is itself a religious insight. Girard, I guess, makes a similar criticism that gods are always reborn, but I think he's less clinical in his approach. He focuses more on the immorality of Nietzsche's attempt to return us to paganism. And I think Jung would also disagree. Like, I don't know if Jung would see Nietzsche as trying to return us to paganism the way Girard would, but he would also, he would not agree with abandoning the Christian religious symbols and the traditional Christian worship and morality. Jung would see a real value to that. And I think Jung imagined there would be some sort of new reform or some new, like, revaluations that would take place within Christianity. Things like the assumption of the Virgin Mary to sort of balance out the Trinity with some image of the divine feminine. That's the kind of thing that Jung sees happening. An opening up of Christianity to being less rigid and dogmatic and maybe conversing a bit more with Gnosticism, alchemy, these things, these mystical traditions. I think that's where Jung's hopes were for. Now, another philosopher who was also accused of wanting to return us to paganism is Martin Heidegger, and we have Heidegger's interpretation of God is dead, which is ridiculed by Girard, by the way, but I think it's actually rather discerning. I agree with it much more. For Heidegger, the death of God is the death of the supra-sensible world. In other words, Nietzsche grounds us in the reality of the senses. He makes his referent for reality the immediate experience of sensation. And meanwhile, Nietzsche struggles against Platonism in the sense that it imposes an intelligible world. It imposes the world of the forms on top of the world of sensation, so supra-sensible. The metaphysicians of the past would have claimed that through reason they were penetrating beyond the errors of the senses. Nietzsche says, no, the error is in the intellect, not the senses. You're not peering behind them, you're layering conceptual gunk on top of the senses. So the death of God is the death of the supersensible world in the Platonic sense. And given what we went over at the beginning of this episode, I think that's probably pretty straightforward. But something else Heidegger says is that only the Christian God, the God of morality as Nietzsche would have understood it, is who dies here. That, as I said before, Nietzsche would have had no problem acknowledging that a new religion is being hinted at, or a new conception of the divine is being shaped. That, quite apropos to the arguments made by Nietzsche about the moral skepticism of Christianity destroying it, well, let's look at what Heidegger says. Quote, yes, he is dead, but which God? The God of morality. The Christian God is dead. the Father in whom we seek sanctuary, the personality with whom we negotiate and bear our hearts, the judge with whom we adjudicate, the paymaster from whom we receive our virtue's reward, that God with whom we do business, the God who is viewed in terms of morality. This God alone is meant when Nietzsche says God is dead. He died because human beings murdered him. They murdered him when they reckoned his divine grandeur in terms of their petty needs for recompense, when they cut him down to their own size. That God fell from power because he was a blunder of human beings who negate themselves and negate life. In one of the preliminary sketches for Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, God suffocated from theology, and morals from morality. Well then, God and gods can die. In a preliminary study to the Birth of Tragedy sketched circa 1870, quite in his early career, Nietzsche notes, I believe in the ancient Germanic dictum, all gods must die. End quote. So, it's a bit difficult to explain how I think about this. I think that this is the area where Girard is wrong in assuming that Nietzsche means all gods are dead. Any conception of the divine is dead, because if he thinks that's what Nietzsche means, then indeed he would have to say that there are things that are unaccounted for in Nietzsche's philosophy. Because, again, as the things we went over at the beginning, there were all these sort of metaphysical and moral things that Christianity did for the psyche of mankind, that whether or not you think mankind actually needs them or they're healthy for mankind, it seems like they're going to recur, regardless of whether you think it's good or not. So, and that sort of follows Jung as well, that there will always be some new conception of the divine. So I agree with Heidegger that Nietzsche is specifically talking about this Christian iteration. That God is dead. And notice the things he says. It's not just the moral God. It's not just the morality of Christianity. It's the fact that we've made God into a personality. So we've made being into a judge and paymaster. Some, again, personal being that we have to do business with or transact with that will judge us. And then, his son can pay the judgment for us. So I suppose I'll say perhaps it's just an unfair reading of Heidegger that Girard takes. That what Heidegger's really saying is that this is a conception of being that Nietzsche sees being overcome. The idea of a personal God, the judge, the paymaster, so on and so forth. The moralist God. We are going to get over that. But overcoming the suprasensible world, the entire Platonic tradition of imposing an intelligible world upon the world of the senses, that, to me, suggests we are overcoming God in the way that pretty much everybody would conceive of a theistic God, whether they call it Christian or not, whether they call it moral or not. That the new conception of God, if we want to even call it that, right? Because Nietzsche says, where before you said God, I'll teach you to say overman. So Nietzsche's even refracting our perspective, our focus back into the sensible world, and not establishing an otherworldly ideal. He's establishing an ideal within the future of the human race, like biologically, in a worldly sense, physiologically, something that will be real. So it's not clear to me that the conception of the divine that Nietzsche thinks will rise up, or that he's trying to create, if we can call it that, will resemble anything that anyone would call God now. Even if we might say that philosophically speaking, he's creating a new divine or a new religion. And, but otherwise, I think I agree mostly with Heidegger. I think where it gets dodgy is it's part and parcel with the way that Heidegger reads Nietzsche as a metaphysician. And Heidegger's claim that Nietzsche's sensible world ends up being dialectically dependent on the suprasensible. So Nietzsche's sensible world doesn't really transcend it. So ultimately, Heidegger agrees that Nietzsche saw the death of God as he agrees that he saw it as the death of the transcendent. And he agrees that Nietzsche understood the impetus for this in morals as well as in metaphysics. But he doesn't really think Nietzsche gets to that immanentist perspective. Immanentist meaning an affirmation of the immediate. Heidegger, ultimately, he thinks Nietzsche's project is perhaps too dialectically involved with Platonism and with Christianity to escape those frameworks. Nietzsche approaches immanence, he approaches it negatively, right? And he approaches it in terms of a negation. He defines immanence by its opposite, its opposition, its antithesis in the transcendental. And remember, Heidegger, as a pure metaphysician in some sense, is himself very interested in investigating that question of being, of the transcendental. He thinks that dealing with the transcendental purely negatively, in a way, you go astray of confronting the central question of philosophy, which is, to Heidegger, what is being? And therefore, Nietzsche contends with Christianity's transcendental vision, but he doesn't offer up one of his own. Heidegger writes, quote, "The empty space demands to be occupied anew and to have the God now vanished from it replaced by something else," end quote. And, all of the writing in Zarathustra that Nietzsche would say, or that a Nietzschean might say, well, it purports to do this, is still, even if it's offering up positive content of a worldly vision, it's still doing so oftentimes explicitly as a dialectical rejection of the transcendent. Now, if you're wondering which type of interpreter might take the strongest issue with Heidegger, that would be Gilles Deleuze, who interprets Nietzsche as anti-dialectical to the core. We talked about this in the episodes on him. He would argue that far from Nietzsche's immanentism being dialectically dependent on the transcendental world as a kind of negation or opposition of it, that Nietzsche's work instead takes for granted the absence of being. That Nietzsche's not a dialectician, he's a pluralist. Opposition or difference to Deleuze doesn't necessarily indicate a relationship of negation. It could be a competition of perspective from simply a different vantage point. That it's not a binary, we should think about the world more in three dimensions, right? So rather than embracing becoming because it's the opposite of transcendent being, Deleuze would argue that the will to power is inherently pluralistic, that Nietzsche's world is a world of multiplicity and movement, and these aspects of the world as will to power sort of preclude the possibility of a static, enduring, unitary being. It precludes the possibility of the transcendent. It's sort of why Nietzsche is called an atheist almost as a presupposition in his work, because his pluralistic understanding of reality, his denial of monism, and therefore his denial of the dialectic from the Deleuzian point of view, precludes that from the start. And that's why Deleuze called Nietzsche's will to power itself an expression of, quote, violent atheism. It's violent because it repudiates what all other nominal forms of atheism cannot bring themselves to do. The atheists in the marketplace, right? Because Nietzsche attacks ontological truths as such. Obviously, Heidegger is going to take a different position because for him, ontology basically is philosophy, and he tries to put Nietzsche into that framework. But Nietzsche in Deleuze's reading, which, again, I've been saying, well, up to this point, Heidegger I agreed with most. I certainly, in this point, I would agree with Deleuze more, that will to power rejects ontological truths, forces us into the mode of perspectivism, which is inherently pluralistic, not as a rejection of the transcendent or a negation of the transcendent, but because such a worldview is truly and assertively different. Nietzsche wasn't simply turning Plato on his head. In other words, he's beginning from a completely different set of observations and insights. And therefore, for Deleuze, the death of God is not the rebirth of a new form of religious feeling, pagan or otherwise, nor is it the emptying of the transcendent, which begs to be replaced by something else, as Heidegger says. It's the beginning of a new, what we might call, a pure or true atheism, which stands in critique of the false or weak atheism of the marketplace. Now, of course, there are many more interpretations than these 5 or so that we've discussed, but I think the ones we've gone over state the most interesting and different cases that have been made about sort of the more perhaps esoteric meanings of this passage. But even though I could talk about more interpretations, we've been going for about an hour about this one passage, so I think we should move on. I think the remarkable thing, though, is that there's a lot of overlap. There's similarities and differences in each interpretation. What's key, and what I think is shared by all honest interpreters about this passage, is that Nietzsche doesn't want to return to the Christian God. Even if the people interpreting him want that, the honest interpreters look at this and say, this is really not about going back to that. That's not the takeaway from the passage. I mean, the Madman says God is decomposing. right? We have to bury God. It's not just that he's dead. We have to bury him. And we have to make his churches and temples into sepulchres for the memory of this dead God. So he's truly dead. There's no going back. That's Nietzsche's position. The main issue, in fact, is not... The issue that Nietzsche's raising is not a debate over whether or not to return to the old God. That idea never enters into this passage. The main issue is actually about the awareness of the event. Deeds, though done, require time, time to be seen and heard. The deed is still far from them. The culture at large has not realized what has happened. That there's this coming and inevitable repudiation of the Christian set of values as these beliefs become unworthy of us. And the plunging of the human mind, therefore, into infinite seas, into the yawning open abyss of being unchained from the ontological, from being, from transcendence, whatever you want to call it. And many, to be sure, probably will attempt to reconstruct some form of worship for the old God. That, there will be new religions based on the old traditions. These will emerge. And, one of the questions underlying the dialogue I presented between these interpreters is, can there be a new sense of religiosity, or maybe we might say spirituality, for those who are able to transcend the old traditions? Those, I think, are really the questions the passage gestures towards, the open questions. Can we survive the undermining of our necessary errors? Can we live without the transcendent? Can we give values to ourselves? And, Nietzsche would say we certainly have, but can we do so self-consciously? We've always given values to ourselves, but now we have to do it in the full light of knowledge that these are created by men. Nietzsche sees these moments of decision, these, elsewhere he would say, like great conscience questions of the intellect. He sees these as fast approaching, and they demand an answer. And it's not clear yet how long we have until we have to have an answer, until there's some renewed conflict or crisis over values. And you could say perhaps that happened in the 20th century, but Nietzsche predicts a coming nihilism that'll cast its shadow over 2 centuries. I would certainly say that we have not worked all of these problems out, in spite of all of the religious conflicts, moral conflicts, and physical conflicts in terms of warfare that have occurred in recent history, and in fact many times throughout history, because I think it's a fair point to say that the gods are always dying and being reborn. And, that's true, that in some sense this coming conflict over values is just a repetition of what came before. But Nietzsche also talks about this event as unprecedented, as tremendous, that, as he'll say later in the book, never before did such a wide open sea exist. So the difference in this case, in this death of God, permitting that it's happened many times in the past, is that I would argue it has to do with the rationalist tendency underlying the Christian religion. I talked about this a bit in my conversation with Gnostic Informant. But the long and short of it is that Christianity is, in some sense, a hyper-rationalist religion. It abolishes the old mythical view of the world, the old mythical view of religion, that was not so concerned with whether or not the stories, quote-unquote, actually happened, like the way, was Hercules a real historical figure? Instead, they looked on the myth as a timeless guide to life or to virtue, true in some superordinate sense that transcends history, transcends objectivity. Whereas Christianity says, no, Jesus was a historical figure, and it promotes a doctrine that is not pluralistic. It does not allow for multiple cults with multiple interpretations. Christianity moves from the Greek religion, which is comfortable with these disputing sects that all disagree. Christianity moves from that to the logic of having one church with one set dogma. The Protestant Reformation is a kind of resurgence of this rationalist tendency to purify the religion, make it coherent, make it consistent. And so with the death of God, we're dealing with the death of the one true God, right? We're not dealing with the death of Dionysus or even Zeus. We're dealing with the death of the one true God, the one coherent, overarching truth that was supposed to apprehend over the entirety of the world. So the death of this God, the Christian God, the moralistic God, the rationalistic God, that really cannot be seen as being the same event as the death of Pan or Dionysus. That when this iteration of the divine dies, what is dying is in some sense the image of the divine as such. And that's why I said we could see it as the creation of a new religion, but whatever is called God or the divine is going to be if we call it that, it's going to be totally different from the way it was conceived of before, to where it's almost, why not just put it in a new category? Which Nietzsche does. He doesn't say, I've invented a new life-affirming God. He says, where you said God, I'm going to teach you to say overman. So, God in the Christian sense has come to stand for the transcendent. It's come to stand for being itself, natural law itself. This version of God, monotheistic God, it's not part of a rotating cast of characters. This conception is like the apotheosis of being. And when that image of God is no longer believable, it's really a new level of crisis. It's a new era of human life and thought that requires an entirely new modus vivendi, way of living, a new spirituality, a new way of thinking, a new set of values. And after the Christianization of Europe, we can't do it with the naivete of a pagan, right? We can't we can't be mythologers in that way. We have to do it in the full light of self-consciousness. We have to know that this is what we're doing. We're legislating values as men. Nietzsche would say somebody like Paul deceived himself into thinking, I'm not legislating values, I'm merely a servant of God, right? When we do this, we're going to have to do it in full light of knowledge that we are humans legislating values, that we have to do something immoral to make people moral, which is a bitter pill for many to swallow. And so this is the most monumental task of all time. That's why Nietzsche says this event divides history. Whoever's born after this, for the sake of this deed, meaning here the death of God and the task to become gods ourselves, Nietzsche says this will be, anyone born after this will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. That is the task. And with that, that is the most time I've ever spent talking about one of these aphorisms during a read-through. But it's such an important passage, and there's probably no better opportunity to compile all of my thoughts on it. And I did bring up a couple of different excerpts from Nietzsche here that I also brought up in the first episode I ever did on the God is Dead aphorism, way back in the season 1. I brought up some things here that I didn't bring up in that episode, and there are a couple things I brought up in that episode that I didn't bring up here. But I think that's an all roundabout way of saying this exegesis that we've done of this passage is probably better than the one we did in the early days of the podcast, because I didn't really talk about any of the interpretations back then, which I think now we're kind of ready to talk about all of that. If you've been listening to the podcast for a long time and you're following along with this whole book, that's where bringing in all of that can be really helpful. In any case, let's move on to the next section, 126, which is just a couple of sentences. It's actually a very fitting follow-up to the death of God. Quote, mystical explanations. Mystical explanations are considered deep. The truth is, they are not even shallow. End quote. And just as a note, I'm using Kaufman's translation, which says superficial. I read it as shallow. It's sometimes translated that way. It's a better turn of phrase. It loses the poetry when we translate it more precisely. It's better to say, it's not deep, it's not even shallow, I think. This passage reminds me of that turn of phrase, it's not even wrong, as in, that's not right, it's not even wrong. It's the kind of thing you might say when someone's entire premise, their entire approach is flawed in some way, or when they miss some fundamental or obvious point. I mean, that's how I felt about Abigail Thorne's videos on Nietzsche, by the way. So that made it very difficult to even approach the critique. So mystical explanations are not deep, they're not even shallow. And keep in mind, being shallow isn't exactly a quote-unquote a bad thing for Nietzsche. I mean, he says the Greeks are shallow. They're superficial at a profundity. They stopped courageously at the surface, meaning at the aesthetics, at the appearance. They lived in appearance. So it's important to say mystical explanations are not that. They posit something beyond or behind the appearances. So an example of a mystical explanation might be the religious interpretation of a dream, or the way people would see certain unusual happenings as portents. If you've ever seen The Seventh Seal, there's a scene where Max von Sydow's character is telling of all the ill omens that have been seen recently, of all these unusual events. I think he says like 2 horses devoured each other, and this number of blackbirds were seen flying this direction, and so on. We might think of like the way they took omens and auguries in the ancient world. Or perhaps an esoteric interpretation of a man's life or some momentous life event that's happened. Perhaps that parallels the events of a saint's life or something of that sort. So Nietzsche is denying the depth of those explanations, but he does it by making clear that they do not reach behind the veil and they don't reveal something about the true nature of being, but they're not even artful interpretations of the surface. And I think this has some origin in Nietzsche's critical analysis of biblical exegesis and Daybreak. I think many have taken a critical eye to the way biblical passages and prophecies have been interpreted and reinterpreted. We'll see how this whole game that people play, it's not really evidence of a beautiful aesthetic interconnectedness of the biblical canon. It's a rather strained, tortured exercise in making the facts fit the theory. As Einstein said, if the facts don't fit the theory, change the facts. So, we see this with the way that interpreters will try to make it so that this even went on, arguably, with the New Testament writers, trying to take the inconsistencies with the things that were said about the Messiah and somehow fit them into Jesus's life. And that may be the best summation of how mystical explanations tend to operate. You start from a conclusion, you reason backward from there. It doesn't explain the world in a philosophical way. It doesn't beautify the world in an aesthetic way. It's neither. It's a falsification of the world. It constrains the world. It binds it to a false image of reality that's created by that suprasensible religious framework. Let's go to 127. Quote, "After effects of the most ancient religiosity, every thoughtless person supposes that will alone is effective, that willing is something simple, a brute datum, underivable, and intelligible by itself. He is convinced that when he does something, strikes something, for instance, it is that he strikes, that he did the strike because he willed it. He does not see any problem here. The feeling of will seems sufficient to him, not only for the assumption of cause and effect, but also for the faith that he understands their relationship. He knows nothing of the mechanism of what happened and of the hundredfold fine work that needs to be done to bring about the strike, or of the incapacity of the will in itself to do even the tiniest part of the work. The will is for him a magically effective force. The faith in the will, as the cause of effects, is the faith in magically effective forces." End quote. There's more in the passage, but we'll leave off here because there's some complicated ideas in the first paragraph, and I want to do some of that interpretive work necessary before we look at the ideas later in the passage that build on this. So the way that people use the term willing is often as this explanatory framework for quote-unquote why actions happen, whether they're free will libertarians or determinists, whether they think the will is free or determined by external causes. They think they're actually saying something by locating the impetus for action within the so-called will. But what exactly are they referring to? Nietzsche says, in fact, nothing about this is explanatory. It's about as explanatory as when Kant says we can make synthetic judgments a priori by virtue of a faculty. In other words, not explanatory at all. So when a thoughtless person acts, they attribute the act to the will, but he knows nothing of the mechanism for how the act happened. The term will for him is a placeholder in a way. It's a signifier for something he doesn't understand. So it's in effect, it's a magically effective force. And the key point is that it is posited as the cause. The will is the cause, the act is the effect. We've discussed in past episodes how the entire interpretive framework of causality is problematic for Nietzsche. He doesn't believe in mechanistic causality, at least not as an objective truth claim. It's one of those perhaps necessary and useful errors, but it's an interpretation of reality that requires we halt our analysis at some arbitrary point, where we calculate backward from the event through a series of so-called causes, and necessarily, in order for that to be explanatory, we have to stop calculating at some point or another. That when we finally say, well, this was the ultimate cause. And that's always an unjustified and incomplete determination. Now, Nietzsche will say more about the will as a cause in the following paragraphs, which I'll now return to. Quote, "Now man believed originally that wherever he saw something happen, a will had to be at work in the background as a cause, and a personal willing being. Any notion of mechanics was far from his mind. But since man believed for immense periods of time only in persons, and not in substances, forces, things, and so forth,
The faith in cause and effect became for him the basic faith that he applies wherever anything happens, and this is what he still does instinctively. It is an atavism of the most ancient origin. The proposition no effect without a cause, every effect is in turn a cause, appear as generalizations of much more limited propositions. No affecting without willing. One can have an effect only on beings that will. No suffering of an effect is ever pure and without consequences, but all suffering consists of an agitation of the will toward action, resistance, revenge, retribution. But in the prehistory of humanity, both sets of propositions were identical. The former were not generalizations of the latter, but the latter were commentaries on the former. When Schopenhauer assumed that all that has being is only a willing, he enthroned a primeval mythology. It seems that he never even attempted an analysis of the will because, like everybody else, he had faith in the simplicity and immediacy of all willing, while willing is actually a mechanism that is so well practiced that it all but escapes the observing eye. Against him I posit these propositions. First, for will to come into being, an idea of pleasure and displeasure is needed. Second, when a strong stimulus is experienced as pleasure or displeasure, this depends on the interpretation of the intellect, which, to be sure, generally does this work without rising to our consciousness. One and the same stimulus can be interpreted as pleasure or displeasure. Third, it is only in intellectual beings that pleasure, displeasure, and the will are to be found. The vast majority of organisms has nothing of the sort. End quote. This passage is troublesome. It's troublesome for those who want to present the will, as Nietzsche saw it, the will to power as a monism, or who imagine it's simply an innovation on the theories of Schopenhauer. This is sometimes how it's portrayed. The only change for Nietzsche is turning the will to live into the will to power. That is an important innovation on Schopenhauer to point out. But will to power, this new interpretation, is essentially multiple and dynamic. And it ultimately does not permit the kind of interpretation of it as a monistic substance that Schopenhauer advanced. I want to compare this paragraph, or this section of the gay science, to a section from Beyond Good and Evil, and it's another critique of the will as it's found in that book. This is Beyond Good and Evil, number 19, quote, "Philosophers are accustomed to speak of the will as though it were the best-known thing in the world. Indeed, Schopenhauer has given us to understand that the will alone is really known to us, absolutely and completely known, without deduction or addition. But it again and again seems to me that in this case Schopenhauer only did what philosophers are in the habit of doing. He seems to have adopted a popular prejudice and exaggerated it. Willing seems to me, above all, something complicated, something that is a unity only in name, and it is precisely in a name that popular prejudice lurks, which has got the mastery over the inadequate precautions of philosophers in all ages. So let us for once be more cautious. Let us be unphilosophical. Let us say that in all willing, there is firstly a plurality of sensations, namely, the sensation of the condition away from which we go, the sensation of the condition towards which we go, the sensation of this from and towards itself, and then besides, an accompanying muscular sensation, which, even without our putting in motion arms and legs, commences its action by force of habit. Directly we will anything. Therefore, just as sensations, and indeed many kinds of sensations, are to be recognized as ingredients of the will, so in the second place, thinking is also to be recognized. In every act of the will there is a ruling thought. And let us not imagine it is possible to sever this thought from the willing, as if the will would then remain over. In the third place, the will is not only a complex of sensations and thinking, but it is above all an emotion, and in fact the emotion of the command." End quote. Okay, so there's a lot here. This isn't even the majority of Beyond Good and Evil, section 19, but it's probably the most relevant section to compare with the gay science number 127. The will is a complex. Willing is something complicated. Schopenhauer takes a popular prejudice and exaggerates it when he reduces the will to one thing, echoing many of the points in this passage in the gay science. But will is not just a moving toward, but a moving away from. It's not only desire, it's not only the drive, it's also a muscular sensation. There are many sensations, in other words, that make up the will, in some sense, the word will is a confounding of unequal things under a single label. And that even what we consider thinking might be seen as willing, or rather suffused with willing, even though philosophers always try to dissociate the two. So if the complex of the will is being oversimplified, made into something unitary, when it is in fact something multiple and moving and pluralistic, relative, maybe even at odds with itself, perhaps even containing mutually exclusive things, well, then we might ask whether Schopenhauer's monism of the will is anything but, as Nietzsche says in the gay science passage, taking that primeval prejudice of the will, which Nietzsche thinks is found in personal gods that were seen everywhere, or in the case of the passage in Beyond Good and Evil, taking the popular prejudice, we might say the form that primeval myth takes in modern thought today, and he's just laundering it into philosophical language without actually explaining anything. And here Heidegger may be a bit helpful again, in that he interprets Nietzsche's will to power as referring to the fact that power is will, and that willing is power. And if this is confusing, well, that's Heidegger, but there's a real point to be made about the fact that power is not a substance. It isn't one thing that you can quantitatively gather. It's not calculated in terms of quantity, at least not in absolute terms of quantity. I suppose you could calculate it that way in relative terms. But what constitutes power is always dependent on the will that wills it. Likewise, what constitutes willing is always a movement from something to something, which again means willing is relative, and again means there's always that the value determination on the basis of which that movement is judged to be good or worthwhile or valuable is in the final analysis the way that Nietzsche will define power. Self-overcoming, moving from what is less complicated, less powerful, less healthy or whatever to something different than that, something hopefully more complex, more powerful, healthier. And I think, and when I say this is all relative, I mean that technically in the sense that every force relates to power in a different way. That power is in some sense the thing that establishes the relationship in the first place. That would be another way to put it. That it is the fundamental relation that characterizes the way that forces in the world interact from Nietzsche's perspective. Relations of power, which is also to say relations of willing. Those two statements to Heidegger say the same thing. And I know that's getting a little bit esoteric, but it's important that we understand will to power in that relational way, with the meaning of both willing and power as, in some sense, not absolute, not monistic, not referring to substances, not referring to a monism. The will to power is perhaps closer to a concept like Tao, as we find it in the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi, and at least the sense that will to power isn't a thing, but an interaction, and that what's being described is a movement. It's not uniform in any sense. It's not singular in any sense. It doesn't always refer to the same content. And so it shouldn't surprise us as much if we know all this when we find in Nietzsche's notes, quote, will, that is a supposition which clarifies nothing else for me. For those who know, there is no willing, end quote. So all these passages considered together, I think it's a great example, by the way, for why Nietzsche's ideas have to be considered in relation to one another. You can't just cherry pick them and put them in whatever context you want. You really need to take on the whole text and cross-reference multiple texts to really get it, because it's very strange at a glance for someone, a philosopher whose whole explanatory framework of nature is will to power, to then turn around and say, actually, there is no willing, which Nietzsche does. But what he means by this is, the will is another necessary fiction. It's another equation of unequal things beneath this vast oversimplification. Feelings of pleasure and displeasure, which he points out past philosophers said necessarily meant an irritation or excitation of the will, but is that explanatory? Or does it simply just group the phenomenon of pleasure and displeasure under a category which simply equates things that are not identical to each other? It groups those with muscular sensations and interpretations, which are, it's not obvious that they are all the same thing, or that we're explaining anything by grouping them. And to get to that other aspect, the interpretation of the intellect, again, thinking and willing for Nietzsche being in some sense unified, That's a really tough proposition because it's so far-reaching. We might say that every instance of willing, of a drive within the human being trying to do something or get away from something, again, we could notice from that how the goal, the content that the will to power relates to is never the same. But every instance of such a drive is also an instance, in Nietzsche's view, of mentation, because each drive has its own logic, its own ruling thought, as he says here, its own thinking, its own language, its own the way that it argues to the self and presents its case, in its own way of calculating to reach its goal. And meanwhile, every apparently abstract and disinterested thought can itself be sourced to some drive, some will. Because after all, we're not just thinking beings, we're living beings. We're not disinterested, disembodied minds. Our psychology is also a physiology. And so Nietzsche says, our interpretation of what constitutes pleasure or displeasure generally does its work without rising to the consciousness. So that means thinking is going on unconsciously. But simultaneously, willing is going on in the conscious world, merely takes there the form of thought. And finally, Nietzsche makes the claim, the majority of organisms therefore can't be said to will because it requires intellect and interpretation. Now, Nietzsche will later go against those claims. I mean, he expands the will to power at sometimes to cover all living things, and at other times even non-living things. But I think his main reason for denying it here, or for defining it the way he defines it here, is to show how the human form of willing is different from other forms of willing, because willing is plural. And that's part of his resistance to Schopenhauer, who looks inward and finds the human experience of will, which Nietzsche says, by the way, is multiple and not one thing. But Schopenhauer then takes this as the most certain proposition and projects it onto all the world, when in fact much of the world doesn't have intellect and the power of interpretation. So fundamentally, is Schopenhauer even talking about the same thing? And Nietzsche would say he's not. And the interesting part of this passage, then, is Nietzsche's critique that these are the result of primeval myths, that the reason why we attribute everything to will is because we have a hangover from the days of attributing everything to personified gods, or in the case of Christianity, to one God, all to God himself, or maybe devils and angels or something. It was a personification of the entire world, or to speak more precisely, the mechanized view of the world is a secularization of that view, that innumerable wills are the cause of various events, whether they're natural or physiological or even political events like wars. So when Schopenhauer presents the world as well, he provides a secular philosophy that, as Nietzsche says, it just reaches back into primordial times and enthrones these primeval prejudices that have become popular prejudices. And we have to ask, to what extent did Schopenhauer even investigate the will at all? To what extent did he try to understand what it is that drives human beings, try to understand the structure of desire, how pleasure and pain and physiological phenomena and drives and impulse and the musculature, how does that all relate to the psychological phenomenon of, the experience of happiness or sadness or knowing or willing? To what extent did he actually investigate or explain any of this? And instead, to what extent did it simply become a placeholder, another signifier for a magically effective causal power? We assume the will's simplicity, but that's only because its complexity is hidden from us. It escapes all but the most observant eye. Now, why is this passage included here? Well, mystical explanations are thought to be deep, but they're not even shallow. The will as a cause, not even to speak of free will, which is the will as an arbitrary cause, which seems even more preposterous, even more magical, so to speak, but just the will as a cause, even leaving out the free will idea. That is, at bottom, a mystical explanation. Whereas a free spirit endeavors to break down the word into multiple parts, find all the complications, understand all the multiplicity and dynamism that's hidden behind popular prejudices, all that's unequal, confounded under the concept. That's how the free spirit operates. Schopenhauer's philosophy is just another hangover of Christianity. It's another shadow of God, or more precisely, a hangover of Platonism, which Schopenhauer draws on directly. And it's a direct link, perhaps in an unconscious way, from the personification of nature the deification of nature, a link from that to the philosophical conclusions that we draw today, and that we then tend to see as a product of a dispassionate abstract reason, when in reality, Schopenhauer has acted as simply a secular type of priest. And this is often Nietzsche's criticism of past philosophers. They're often a subspecies of priest, not really a philosophical type, a new type of thinker. Let's go to 128, the value of prayer. Quote, "Prayer has been invented for those people who really never have thoughts of their own, and who do not know any elevation of the soul, or at least do not notice it when it occurs. What are they to do at sacred sites and in all significant situations in life where calm and some sort of dignity are called for? To keep them at least from disturbing others, the wisdom of all founders of religions, small as well as great, has prescribed to them the formulas of prayers, as mechanical work for the lips, that takes some time and requires some exertion of the memory, as well as at the same time fixed posture for hands, feet, and eyes. Let them, like the Tibetans, keep chewing on the cud of their Om Mani Padme Hum innumerable times, or as in Benares, count the name of the god off their fingers, Ram Ram Ram, and so on, with or without charm, or honor Vishnu with his 1,000 names, or Allah with his 99, or let them use prayer mills and rosaries. The main thing is that this work fixes them for a time and makes them tolerable to look at. Their kind of prayer has been invented for the benefit of the pious who do know thoughts and elevations of their own. But even this type has weary hours when a sequence of venerable words and sounds and a pious routine are welcome. But suppose these rare human beings, the religious person is an exception in every religion, know what to do in such cases. The poor in spirit do not know what to do. And if one forbade them their prayer rattling, one would deprive them of their religion, as Protestantism shows us more and more by the day. What religion wants from the masses is no more than that they should keep still with their eyes, hands, legs, and other organs. That way they become more beautiful for a while and look more like human beings." End quote. This is a wonderful example of Nietzsche's somewhat Machiavellian position that religion can be a positive thing for the populace at large, even if it would be harmful in the highest degree, if ingested by creative types of people, by the unique and unparalleled types, by those who might produce great works or lead nations and so on. I mean, remember what he said about Pascal. I mean, this is like a great mathematical wunderkind, clearly philosophically gifted mind, and he's just totally ruined by Christianity. And Nietzsche says Christianity has, the greatest sin it ever committed was what it did to Pascal. So, in spite of the fact that religion can be very bad for those people with great potential, there's a value to the religious practices. Notice here he doesn't talk about the morality of the religions involved. He talks about the effect the rituals will have. The religious morality, which is transmitted through it, is a very different question. The question he raises here is the power of the rites, which in this case he says it makes the adherents seem more human, even the masses. And is this simply a shot at the masses, or maybe is it a shot at humanity, right? Because surely it makes them more beautiful, but it makes them more like human beings. Remember that man is a thing to be overcome. So there's something about our religions of the masses that have to pacify and tame and impose discipline there's something about that that's definitive of human existence in some way, that seems to occur and reoccur in all nations and all ages and all contexts. That there's some form of mass religiosity required to bind them together as one. And for better or for worse, it always comes with that series of rites and rituals and taboos. But as to whether, is this a shot at the masses or at humanity, I think it's a bit of both. To look a little more pious, to look a little more ascetic. We might say that elevates man, which we might say before that is merely an animal like other animals. That elevates man into something different. What animal in the state of nature behaves that way, who's able to sit still and recite these formulas with no, I'm not talking about going into hibernation or something to consciously make that decision. I am just going to sit here and pursue nothing. I'm just going to sort of repeat these words, right? And that there's something even beautiful about this, but we should seriously ask, why is it that the priestly route to humanizing ourselves is so definitive of what it means to be human, or of the human story so far? Why have we always taken the priestly route to elevating mankind and making him something beyond the animal? And it's worth noting, Nietzsche says, the genuinely religious person is a rarity among the religious. For most of them, it's rote activity, it's prayer rattling. It's, he says, without this, the Protestants would have no religiosity at all. Very Kierkegaardian, once again. So if you forbid people those words and formulas that just, you can't just cite scriptures, you can't just memorize it, you'd forbid them their whole religion. And their religion has no content beyond that, right? Sola scriptura. But that's precisely who prayer was invented for, those types of people. The people who have no thoughts of their own. They never sit still and at peace in a state of repose. That we might say that the true ascetic, the truly religious person knows this, or that even the philosophical thinker kind of approximates this by ceasing from activity so he can think, which is a creative act. And this comes with all the caveats, right? That thinking's not always peaceable, but the philosopher attains some beautiful aesthetic of dignity in his quiet, thoughtful pose or something like that. Meditation's not always peaceable in terms of what's happening within. But again, that beautifies the human animal in that way. But it's a different type of religiosity. The common person who doesn't really connect with the spirit on that level is just told, just say Om Mani Padme Hum. And, maybe a concrete way of thinking about this, we could look at Pure Land Buddhism versus Theravada Buddhism. In the Theravada tradition, the Pali Canon, the oldest form of Buddhism, they would emphasize Buddha's last words, right? Work out your own salvation with diligence. A human life is the thing that grants the opportunity to let go of your karma. There's no higher power than yourself that is going to help you attain liberation. It comes from your own practice of the Buddhist way. In Pure Land Buddhism, they say the Buddha Amitabha created this paradisiacal plane of existence where achieving enlightenment is easy. It's called the Pure Land. It's pure. There's no desires pulling you and distracting you there. And if you call on his name, even just one time, he'll make sure you get reincarnated there. So Pure Land Buddhists just chant Amitabha's name, and nothing else is really necessary for them, right? Saying his name is sufficient. So Nietzsche would say the reason why that development occurred, the reason why that religion spins off of Buddhism, which seems to almost be its opposite in many ways, total other power versus total self-power, is because the Pure Land approach is for the many, that the Theravadian approach is for the few, the genuinely disciplined religious types. And one might ask, what does Pure Land give the many, right? What do they get out of just repeating Amitabha Buddha's name? Well, Nietzsche would say in the final analysis, it civilizes them by making them, the way he puts it here, that just makes them less irritating. It makes them less uncouth, at least for certain times and certain contexts, while they pray or say their mantras or whatever. And over time, maybe that changes them overall. It tames them in some way. That's the reason for it. So fascinating that Nietzsche not only challenges the causality of the will as a shadow of God and a mystical explanation in the sections following the Madman passage, but it's even interesting than the passage after that. He acknowledges the usefulness of a religion here. But the framework is naturalistic, we might say, almost down to that level of physiology again. It's valuable because it teaches people to sit still. So religion is important, or it's valuable, for at least one reason here. But the reason that he gives is what it does to the body of the common man, not what it does for his soul, or even for his mind. Let's go to 129, this one's shorter. Quote, "The conditions for God. God himself cannot exist without wise people, said Luther, with good reason. But God can exist even less without unwise people. That, our good Luther, did not say," end quote. This almost has the format of a joke. It is a joke, so it's a real shame to have to explain it, but Nietzsche says Luther's right, God can't exist without wise people. Almost certainly, Nietzsche thinks this is true in a very different way than Luther thinks it's true. But as we'll see, when Nietzsche writes in his genealogy, the ascetics, the priestly classes, are very wise people, and God can't exist without them, that the ones that maintain the idea of the other world, because they're the ones who create that idea. But God can exist even less without unwise people. Again, wisdom is the thing that the ancients called useless to the many. And it's always been the case that the majority of religious followers are not deeply spiritual or wise. They're the type of people who simply say their prayers, who don't have any thoughts, critical or otherwise. They don't contemplate the metaphysics or the morals of their religion. So that's the real foundation of the religious belief, the populace. So there's an elitist element to this passage, to be sure. But there's a broader point to be made insofar as the religious mode of thinking is itself unwise by definition, that perhaps the great legislators of all religions were cynical in their way, up to the point, right up to the point where they begin to deceive themselves about what they're doing. There was something wise about them. But once they buy into their own deception, they become unwise. Because the religious explanation of the world, as we said before, it's not even shallow. So the extent to which the holy man himself is deceived, that he gets high on his own supply, as we say, believes his own otherworldly claims, which most of them eventually do or likely do, he's also in some way unwise. He may be virtuous, he may be admirable, he may be pious, but as Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, if you still regard the stars as something, quote, above you, you lack the eye of wisdom. So in that epigram, Nietzsche is aimed at a shift of our perspective to an understanding of the relativity of valuations. The stars are not above you. Above and below lose all meaning if you imagine them in an absolute sense, because the stars are also beneath you. They're on, beyond the other side of the planet that's under your feet. So again, the terror of the Madman passage comes up when we bring in this relativity, right? Whither is there up or down? Whither are we moving? One can feel untethered when you begin to look at the world in terms of relative values. Now, that's precisely what the priest does away with his dualism of good and evil, with his dogmatism, his absolutism, right? Which, supposing that he's not merely a clever manipulator himself, in a way makes him a font of unwisdom, too. But above all, I think the thrust of the passage is that even if religion is in some way a clever manipulation, it can't remain a clever manipulation if it is to have any real power. It requires believers, not just people who assent to its premises because they think it'll be good for society or something like that, and not just the people who genuinely penetrate into religious paradoxes and the deep questions. It requires, again, those believers who chew the cud of their prayers. That's what really is the base of the religion. Let's move on. This is 130, quote, "A dangerous resolve, the Christian resolve to find the world ugly and bad, has made the world ugly and bad," end quote. This is pretty straightforward, but it's worth saying a brief word on pity, and how Nietzsche would argue that pity, Mitleid in German, which means suffering with, expands suffering rather than reduces it. It transmits suffering from one to another. We could also see this with other aspects of Christianity, by the way. Ressentiment would seem to be contagious. When people act out of resentment and begin to act maliciously towards others, they also inspire others to become resentful toward them, or just resentful in general. We could also say the same with guilt, that those with a strong guilt complex themselves are often the quickest to judge others or wish to impose that guilt on others. Basically, every pathological thought pattern of Christianity is contagious in this way. But there's a deeper significance here in that, again, Christianity is that apotheosis of Platonism, of the Platonic rejection of the sensible world, or superimposition of a supersensible world. So the sensible world is the world of the flesh. It's a world ruled by Satan. It's a world of sin, purity, grace, forgiveness, eternal happiness. All of that exists somewhere else. It's in some imagined realm. It's a world we can have faith in. It's a world we can maybe even try to prove with reason, but we don't experience it. It's beyond the senses. So in a very real sense, the Christian holds that creation, corrupted as it is by sin, is ugly and bad, at least in comparison to the superordinate world that God offers us, in eternal heaven. And we don't have to merely imagine this as a hypothetical that someone could possibly extrapolate that conclusion from Christianity, that the world is ugly and bad. We see that attitude in believers all the time. We even see it in philosophical believers like Pascal and Kierkegaard. And we see this antipathy to the flesh as far back as the founder of the religion, Paul, We see the tendency toward iconoclasm, the opposition to physical or aesthetic beauty, the exaltation of the weak and the sick, condemnation of sexuality and lust, and the claims that without salvation, our existence in this world would be a terrifying, horrible existence. The precise problem with these evaluations is that they are themselves creative, or we might say motivating. I mean, one of the fundamental claims of Nietzsche is that our actions are at bottom driven by value judgments, because every drive, every impulse we possess, every push or pull towards or away from is itself an evaluation, whether to designate something as pleasurable or unpleasurable, harmful or beneficial, worthwhile or not. And we talked about this in the previous episode. Nietzsche even holds this about our perceptions. All experiences are moral experiences, even when it comes to our sense perceptions. So our experience of the world is based on value judgments. So we can take this passage in a couple of ways. To make the judgment, the evaluation that the world is ugly and bad will make you literally perceive it that way, as ugly and bad. But it also means it will drive you to spread these thought habits, which ultimately denigrate existence and make life less appealing. It will do this by imposing moral laws, which makes human existence sexless and static and passionless, or that makes ambition or creativity into sins, or chastising those who enjoy the pleasures of the flesh. And I don't just mean sex, but like dancing or feasting or just enjoying the movement or the aesthetics of the human body. To impute guilt in people for all the things that their instincts are aimed at. This literally makes their existence ugly and bad. It makes their experience of the world worse than it would be if that morality wasn't there. As a final note on this passage, Hollingdale has argued that there's a backdrop of Lutheran pietism in Nietzsche's thought, in his ideas of amor fati and the embrace of the world, that even in Nietzsche's atheism, he perhaps internalized those pietist values, who held that creation must be a fundamentally good thing, because God made it after all, and hating life is therefore a sin. Whether you buy that explanation or not, one could argue that not all forms of Christianity express themselves in this way. But I think there's a reason why Nietzsche doesn't, in his published work, he doesn't say Lutheran pietism is fine, all other forms of Christianity are bad. I think he would say those life-denying values exist in the Christian religion, and they're in fact the main point of the religion. So even when one sect or another minimizes those values, the sick impulses are always there, and that they actually make things worse. They don't just appear to make things worse. It isn't just a sad and sorry interpretation of existence that goes no farther than that. This sad view of existence makes existence a sad and sorry place. So even though Nietzsche was just talking about one of the potential positives of religion just before this, I think this makes it clear that overall the values it promotes are, for lack of a better word, well, ugly and bad. We're going to look at one final section today. This is number 131. Quote, Christianity and suicide. When Christianity came into being, the craving for suicide was immense, and Christianity turned it into a lever of its power. It allowed only two kinds of suicide, dressed them up with the highest dignity and the highest hopes, and forbade all others in a terrifying manner. Only martyrdom and the ascetic's slow destruction of his body were permitted. End quote. So, pretty straightforward passage to end on, but it's somewhat interesting how Nietzsche thinks the Christian praise for certain forms of suicide, how that came to be exalted or why that occurred. And here he suggests there was like a pre-existent longing for suicide that in a time such as the first centuries after Christ, under the domination of the Romans, this mass of slaves and proletarians and foreigners who turned to Christianity had no prospects in life. Their lives consisted of little other than service to the whims of aristocrats, who in many cases treated them as disposable objects. And it's not for nothing that there were quite a few messiahs in Jesus' time, that the predictions of an imminent Armageddon were also common in those days, that everyone seemed to think the end was upon them. And, Jesus even says some of his disciples will still be alive when he returns to set things right. So I'm not saying people were killing themselves left and right here, but rather that life was much cheaper in those days, much shorter. And there were all these ideas just floating around in the zeitgeist that everything's about to end at any time. So there's just lots of nihilistic energy, and consequently people are crying out for a savior figure. So Nietzsche suggests Christianity used that longing for suicide to its advantage. It sanctified certain types of self-destruction that promoted its own morality. So the slow destruction of yourself under the ascetic regime of self-tyranny, self-torment. And if you've read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, you know how far that can go. I won't go into that further here since we're toward the end of the episode, but the other one is martyrdom, to be killed for the faith, sometimes in horrific ways. And there's been some disputes about the degree to which there was actually this overwhelming number of Christian martyrs that may have been exaggerated in the early days. But the church absolutely glorifies martyrdom and gives it sanction. It gives sanction to these forms of suicide. It values them as good. Now, all other forms of suicide, if you take your life out of despair, or maybe the way a noble takes their life rather than face dishonor, those types of suicide become sins, punishable by the worst possible thing, immediate hellfire. Why would that be? Because Christianity is harnessing a pre-existent suicidal energy, to speak metaphorically. This drive towards suicide, this desire for suicide, can be effectively used. Christianity takes it and channels it into, wholly channels it into methods that are to the glory of the religion. And so the unholy uses for this drive, the uses for the nihilism, the suicidal nihilism that don't glorify Christianity, have to be cut off. They have to become the worst possible taboo, so that this very real longing for self-destruction is channeled solely into self-destruction that repudiates the world. The forms of self-destruction that glorify the suppression and the emasculation of the instincts, and ultimately the forms of self-destruction that present this value that the world of the spirit is better than the world of the flesh. So there's an immense nihilism, an immense longing for the end, and Christianity sees this as an opportunity. It sees this as its power, that it can use this power to devalue the world. And in a way, this might have preserved the Christians, as Nietzsche pointed out in the sections I quoted near the beginning of this talk. But nevertheless, we see here once again just how sickly the values of Christianity really are to Nietzsche. Why he says that in the Christian mode of valuation, everything bad, everything sickly rises to the top. Because it literally takes a longing for death and makes this one of its most elevated states of the soul, supposing only that the one who longs for death longs to die as a martyr for God. That's all for this week, everyone. I told you things were getting good, didn't I? I'm glad we got to do the in-depth reading of the Madman passage, look at all these surrounding passages as well for context and other interpretations. I think a lot of the aphorisms covered after that one are very helpful to cover directly afterwards. Don't let anyone say there's no structure to Nietzsche's works. There definitely is. We'll pick up next week, still in Book 3. Hope you're enjoying this. I definitely am, and I hope you'll join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.